Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Back in November 2023, the state of the supply chain was front and center on most people's minds, including everyday Americans. Inflation was seemingly out of control, disruptions in the supply chain were occurring on a daily basis, and people were demanding action from their leaders. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. I am your host, Brian Strait, and today we're discussing some of the aftermath of that time and where the supply chain stands today with Melanie Hilton, Senior Vice President of Community Engagement at GS1 US. Melanie is GS1 US's retail supply chain guru and a go to for all supply chain optimization related tech, from the Internet of Things and blockchain to AI and computer vision. So I'm pleased to have her join me today to talk about these topics. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you, Brian. It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
To get started, many people may not know who GS1 US is. Can you tell us a little bit about the company and what your role there is?
Yes, happy to. GS1 US is a member of GS1 Global. We're a not for profit standards organization that focuses on unique identification and supply chain standards. So, obviously, this topic is near and dear to my heart. But GS1 US is one of 116 member organizations responsible for implementing GS1 standards all over the world. So, while the standard is global, implementation is local, and we work with over 300,000 businesses in the US every day to focus on how we uniquely identify objects, locations, and entities, how we capture those identifiers in machine readable technologies, and how we share pertinent data that allow us to move products from birth essentially to the consumer and the patient, both in retail and healthcare contexts.
Yeah. So it's making sure that companies basically communicate with each other and work together, right? In essence.
Yes. Yep,
Yeah.
at an interoperable level, right? I think that that's the thing about standards is the goal is to create a collaborative level playing field that allows people to compete on top of that, but to ensure that you can get all the players in so that you can get those scaled adoption benefits.
Yep. Yeah. And we're going to get a little bit later in the podcast. We'll get into a little bit about standards and some of the technologies and whatnot there. But to get started, as I mentioned in the opening, I want to talk about the supply chain disruptions that we had last year. And you guys are on the front of this as well. Um, we had disruptions last year, and then we had inflation, which seemed to be out of control, and many people blame that on the supply chain, right? Costs were
Mhm.
going up. In response to that, I think President Joe Biden decided, hey, we need to do something. We need to show the Americans that we're leading on this topic. So in November, he announced the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience. So as I understand it, that council has been tasked with producing a report by the end of this year. I think December 31st is the deadline, actually. But I want to get your thoughts on the need for a council like this and what it will do.
Well, I think anytime the private sector and the government engage in dialogue, it's probably beneficial rather than solutions being considered in a vacuum. So I'm very interested in what we work with the government a lot at GS1 US, and they always talk about the community as the trade. So I'm
Mhm.
always very interested in what members of the trade are seeing in their own practices, and whether it'll be up to the people that get interviewed or participate in the efforts of the council to sort of weigh in on how much of this has the potential to be regulatory driven versus we live in a capitalist economy, so it's very interesting about that survival of the fittest, and you want to sell things and you want to do it profitably so that you can build and sell more things. So how much the interplay between the federal government and people who are actually building products and selling things to the American consumer can
Yeah.
come to agreement on how we do that more efficiently.
Yeah, I think as you were just speaking now, I was just thinking that this reminds me a little bit of the Environmental Protection Agency's, the EPA's Super Truck program that they've run for years. So those of you that may be familiar with it, that is a program that EPA has run to bring the truck makers, the big truck makers, your Mack, Volvo, Freightliner, etc., together to develop technologies for their trucks to make them more fuel efficient going forward. And that project has produced a lot of great initiatives that have actually been implemented by the private sector into the trucks going forward. So it sounds like the same kind of thing here, right? I mean, bring
Yeah.
the community together and come up with some ideas. Some of it may be regulatory driven. Some of it may be, um, just ideas that bounce around that people decide they want to implement.
Agreed.
In many ways, yeah. Um, Biden and his administration have not been shy about diving into supply chain issues during their time. So,
Right.
I mentioned there's been a number of, and some people may not see these as supply chain bills per se, but the Chips and Science Act for sure. The Inflation
Yep.
Reduction Act had components of supply chain in it. The bipartisan infrastructure law that passed had supply chain as part of it as well. I don't know what this council will come up with as far as recommendations go, but can you speak at all from an industry standpoint about how effective you think the council can be in helping America build a more sustainable and resilient supply chain? Can it build on some of these things that have already taken place?
I think so. And maybe the one thing that when you look at what the administration has been doing, maybe the one thing it doesn't take into account is what's some of the market pressures. You talked about it in your opening around disruption,
Mhm.
around geopolitical unrest, and natural disasters. Right. One thing I've learned about supply chain in the many too many decades, I guess, I've been working in the space is everybody wants to be able to predict the weather. So if the
Yeah.
council can come up with a way to predict the weather correctly, I think we're going to see some great progress. But aside from that, when you talk about sustainable and resilient, so I first think about something I'd originally heard Procter and Gamble say about good for me, good for my family, good for the planet. This idea that when I think about sustainability, there are multiple contexts, and so how do I look at that holistically? But for me, resilience is about being able to succeed in the face of adversity. And whether that adversity comes in the form of actual raw material shortages, disruptions in waterways and other when I'm trying to move product and not great things are happening, right? Whether that's a ship getting stuck or whether um, you have people who are kind of weaponizing the supply chain and causing disruption. So I think that discussion is important because there are probably some things that as American businesses we would be looking in partnership with government about ways to co-facilitate resiliency. But I also think it's nice when you get into the halls of Washington D.C. Are you immune to what happens outside and just the everyday practicalities of can I get the cotton that I need in order to make this new garment? Can I actually source the materials I need to bring fresh food to people all over the world? I think people from the supply chain side of the conversation bringing that into the discussion for the council is going to be very valuable.
Yeah, I think there's a saying, right, that all politics is local, right? I think the
Yep.
supply chain is the same way. All supply chain is local. We don't think of it that way, but in the end, I, as the consumer, want to make sure that I have my item, whatever that is. Or I, as
Yes.
my business, I want to make sure that I
Yes.
have my material. I don't care necessarily how it gets to me until it doesn't get to me, right?
Yep. Agreed.
So, yeah, so I think it's much the same way. Shifting, just want to move past politics a little bit because the council is political in some nature. But we came about because of all the disruptions that we saw. And one of the things that I've thought about in recent months, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well, is that whether we actually are seeing more disruptions today in the supply chain, or are we more aware of those disruptions because of social media, because of technology, more connectivity and data sharing between stakeholders, maybe? I mean, I guess you've been in the supply chain for a number of years. I just wanted to get your thought as far as whether we're just more aware of the disruptions that we have and are reacting to them more, or
Yep.
whether this is something that actually is really changing in the way the supply chain operates in the modern times.
Well, real-time access to whatever's going on all over the world just continues to increase. And
Yeah.
so I do agree with you that the average consumer's awareness is heightened. And probably we've all spent the past few years just talking pandemic to death, but I do think the pandemic was a critical uh, conversation opener because of the shortages, right? So it started with what I couldn't get on the shelf, which was
Yeah.
toilet paper or avocados or whatever I couldn't get on the shelf during a time when there was a lot of other anxiety and unrest. And so that now translates into this always on media. I have everybody's opinion at my fingertips, whether it's fact based or not. So I think honestly, it's the real time access continuing to increase. But I would also say, Brian, I think there's a little bit of what's going on here is that the visibility is exposing lack of technology investment. And that
Yeah.
also became clear in the pandemic when you heard some retailers say, we've just accelerated 5 years worth of digital investment into 3 weeks. And you're in your head, you're saying, well, why didn't you do that before? Well, I was never compelled, right? I was never
Right. Yep.
compelled. And so now when you look at just the fact of how disruptive one event can be, to months worth of product supply in any given part of the world, then you really have to say, are my data collection systems outdated? Do I have my data structured in a way I can put it to work? Am I sharing it even internally? Oh my goodness, the internal data silos are killing. But I think these to me are all things that are part of, now that we're aware, what are we going to do about it? But yeah,
Yeah.
I think that if it's leading to us talking about it versus just, thinking of each event is not really taking it on, as a holistic view and saying these events adding up can have a real detriment to our company's profitability and our future, if we don't address them.
Yeah, so I think it's a matter of, right, of the companies being aware of it and probably aware of it previously, but just saying, "Hey, this is an isolated incident. I'm just going to ignore it," right? And now saying,
Right.
"Hey, these are continued incidents. Can we prevent them, or can we mitigate damage that they are causing in some
Yep.
way?" Kind of thing. Shifting gears just a bit here. The other part of you have a lot of expertise in technology, as I mentioned in the opening. So, and blockchain and AI is up your alley here a little bit. I wanted to start and talk a little bit about blockchain because I remember writing a ton of stories 5, 6 years ago. Blockchain was the thing, right? It was going to change the industry as we know it. And it seemed, and I had some people at the time like, really, hey, this is the best thing we've ever had, right? And others say,
Hmm.
yeah, let's just see how it evolves a little bit. I think there was a lot of hype on it early. Then it kind of died down, and you stopped hearing so much about blockchain related projects. And I know this brought blockchain out there these days. As we sit there in 2024, where does blockchain stand in the supply chain these days? Is that still a viable technology that companies should be exploring? Are there still legitimate use cases out there for it?
Yes, if anything, I think all of that effort spent on blockchain helped reinvigorate conversations around some broken processes we had
Yeah,
related to traceability and transparency. I think also, the fact that we touted blockchain as being a solve for something that we hadn't solved before. Like, because of blockchain, we can solve this problem. And no, the truth is, we could have solved the problems with prior database technologies and we just chose not to. So, I think anytime somebody can get what we were most excited about at GS1 US is this was reinvigorating the conversation around supply chain visibility. And now you look at some of these disruptive events and think even more so. So, what I
yeah,
love about blockchain, whether you implement it in its pure form or whether you just take the concept of blockchain, right? It's time ordered transactions. So you ensure that as things occur, that's how they're being recorded. You have immutability. So you can't delete things, which means there's no funny business in theory going on a blockchain because everything gets noted. Even if it's a
yeah,
corrective action, you've recorded it. I think that the concept of sharing data more broadly, we certainly can't go wrong with that. This lack of trading partner, data sharing, this is something that's come up actually, in the AI conversation as well, and I know we're going to talk about that. But I think data sharing is such a critical foundation, and so what that led me to was this conclusion that what blockchain represents is distributed data systems. So rather than
mhm,
having a giant cloud in the sky with everything I ever needed to know and some, magical puppeteer or the wizard behind the scenes controlling all of that data, what blockchain has advocated is distributed data systems, which I think that's the internet. The internet is a distributed data system. And this was a way to say, how do I bring distributed data systems to supply chain? So I think blockchain represents a lot of great opportunity. Now, whether that's the technology you choose to implement, I don't know that that's always the right solution, but we are seeing successful deployments of blockchain. Its biggest challenge, even here today in 2024, is these are still a bit walled gardens, right? Like the protocols are not interoperable. So I can't just sit on any blockchain solution and share data with someone on any other blockchain solution without
yeah.
kind of a standard mechanism to bridge the gaps in, in sharing the data back and forth.
Yeah. So blockchain is out there still. I mean, it's we've moved past the hype cycle.
Yep.
It's getting in there, and I guess the only job that's that really costing is the poor wizard, behind the scene, right? I mean, he may be
Yeah,
out of a job
yeah.
these days, right?
Well,
Yeah,
one other add-on comment that to that though is that the data on a blockchain is only as good as your willingness to trust it. And so I
yeah,
do think there is a role for trust anchors, not for someone to, control the data, but to have contributed a valid piece of information to put that puzzle together. GS1 is one of those because we're providing sort of like item identification and into that role. But what a company says about its products, if they're a trust anchor for that data, putting that into a blockchain that also points back to the trust anchor without the trust anchor having to get involved in every conversation. So there's a lot of
yeah.
interesting nuances about the technology that I think we still have yet to exploit.
Yeah, nice. I was fascinated by blockchain when it came out, and then, like I said, it kind of the hype kind of disappeared. I think, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, blockchain, nobody cares, nobody cares." But it's real, it's out there, and
Yeah.
it's useful. Which is a nice segue, I think, to AI and generative AI, right? And the point I was going to make was that what I remember of the blockchain hype 5 or 6 years ago, I think the AI and generative AI hype is even more. But
Hmm.
unlike the blockchain, where it seemed like I was in this hype cycle and I wasn't in the pilot or implementation stage, it's almost like I've just skipped and merged these three stages together for AI. Right? I mean, it's like the
Mm-hmm.
hype has grown. We've immediately started pilot projects. We're implementing like crazy everywhere we go. So, and I don't think there's anybody out there that these days will not say, unlike blockchain, that will say that AI is not a valuable piece of the supply chain going forward. From your perspective and what you guys are working with, where are we in this cycle of AI at this point? Are we still in the beginning stages of this? Is this a mature enough technology now that we would consider it mainstream and it's like you need to have it? Or there should be there still be some waiting maybe before you
Oh,
get into some of that?
I honestly think that AI has been part of the supply chain for a lot longer than we've probably called it AI. And maybe if you look particularly at machine learning as a subdomain of AI, the
Yeah,
notion that you're gathering data and creating algorithms to put that data to work in theoretically a predictive way, analyzing past trends as well, right? We've been doing that for years and years when we've tried to do things like collaborative planning and forecasting. So I think there's no question that you should be leveraging AI in your supply chain. I think the question becomes kind of three things that we've seen as themes over the past 6 months. Is the data available? Because AI is a data hungry system and it's
mm,
only going to be as good as the data you feed it. So first of all, you have to have a lot of data to train the model. Secondly, the data has to be clean. So data hygiene is such a critical element of a good AI implementation because going back 2 decades in conversations around product master data, we would always talk about garbage in, garbage out. But that
yeah,
becomes even more important in an AI system because you're actually leaning on that AI system to not only analyze your data but to make you a recommendation. Now, are you going to trust that recommendation? If you fed that system bad data, it's not really the fault of the system, right? So I think data availability, data hygiene, and the third one, as I had mentioned in the prior discussion, is around data sharing. And I've heard several people comment that like incentives for data sharing are not where they need to be among supply chain trading partners. What a downstream partner like a retailer finds valuable, and whether or not they want to share that back upstream to a supplier who might be able to put that data to work in terms of planning what next product they might introduce. There's still a lot of I once heard an executive in the healthcare industry and pharmaceuticals say to me, look, blockchain technology, AI, all these technologies, we can put them to use in our supply chain, but it's the human behavior and the change management component that we have to focus on. So I actually think AI as a technology is such an augmentation to human labor in many
yeah.
respects that we would be remiss not to pursue an AI strategy, but I think we have to be realistic with ourselves about whether or not we have the right data in the right quantity to power AI to derive the benefits from it. Honestly, no different than blockchain because we used to say the same thing, right? A blockchain's only as good as the data you
Just,
put
yeah.
you put on it.
Yeah, I think my greatest fear for AI at this point is that the systems are going to be generating suggestions and making decisions, right? In some cases going forward,
Mhm.
on data that's not good to start with.
Yep.
So it's like the old telephone game, right? I mean, it's by the time they make a decision 5 years from now, it's going to be a wrong decision. And at, at some point, I think we're going to hear some public company that's going to blame their earnings on the AI because they use the AI to generate these decisions, and they made a bunch of products nobody wanted or something. Like
Yep.
it's I can see this happening, and I'm waiting. I think there's got to be some company down the road, 5, 10 years from now, that's going to end up going under because the data they had initially when they built their AI system was bad.
Well, you'll have to see how the stockholders and the board react to that, because I'm not sure that argument will hold well. But
Yeah, I don't know. But speaking around AI too, and I think this is where GS1 US comes in too. We talk about standards and compatibility among AI systems, and most of us remember the early days of the smartphone, right? And you were an Android user, you were an Apple user, and if you used one, you couldn't didn't have access to apps and
mhm.
systems up from the other, right? There was no way to you couldn't even charge the two of them on the same device, for that matter. As we implement more AI into our supply chain networks, and especially generative AI, is there enough being done to ensure that these systems from the various companies, the various AI systems, are able to integrate with each other and we don't repeat these interoperability mistakes of the past?
Well, so I think, AI systems are like blockchains. They proliferate, and there's a lot of money to be made in deploying, the newest and most different widget from the last one. But what I would say is, since we've already established that data is the foundation for AI, this is truly where there's so much opportunity. And when you going back to kind of what I said at the beginning around GS1 standards, while they're very unsexy, I mean, standards is like the place everybody goes at the end when they're pulling their hair out over implementation roadblocks and saying, "I've got to get past this adoption plateau. Please help me." So GS1 companies like GS1 or others who did things like around the HTTPS standard and right, SMS, even texting, to your point, between an Android and an Apple device that we didn't have in the beginning.
Yeah,
Solving all those problems requires people like the folks I work with at GS1 US to say, I'm willing to do the heavy lift to look at, can we establish an interoperable data model? Just because you're going to layer a lot of intelligence on this, and that's your competitive differentiation, but the data itself has to be the building block that we share in order to facilitate what special decisions you want to make and what special decisions I want to make. So I think that whole idea of the very very straightforward principles of identify what needs to be identified, whether that's a product, a case, a pallet, a container, a ship. When if you had a container on the Ever Given, you probably wanted to know it was on there because you were going to have a disruption. Then
yeah,
you capture that. The only way, so this is the other thing, AI is a testimony to automation. And when you look at all the things we've done over the past 50 years to put things like barcode technology and RFID technology, even sensors today, and the explosion of IoT is all about driving automation because we want the machine to have access to data, be able to ingest it and do something intelligent with it as quickly and as much as possible. So capture that in an automated way. And then the point around sharing is give it to the systems and the people that can do something intelligent with it. So I actually think the foundation of standards is there. What will be interesting to see is the kind of data that actually powers AI systems over the long term, right? Gives us those advanced decision making capabilities. And how much of that do we already have available through standard mechanisms, or do we have to build? So
yeah.
that's really, for speaking, kind of selfishly for my role, how can we as a standards org continue to facilitate those in, in intercompany conversations, because that's the data that's going to make AI systems intelligent.
Yeah, I look. I mean, even intra-company
Yeah,
conversations, right?
sure, for
I mean,
sure,
this.
for
I mean,
sure.
how many companies out there have 6 different systems and they can't talk to each other? You know,
Yep.
right?
And I had an executive tell me a couple weeks ago that she can go and look at all those 6 systems and determine, let AI help her determine what the right value is. She has no power to push that value back upstream and tell the 5 systems that were wrong or whatever, this is
Yeah,
the correct value. I'm like, this is the problem. This is the
yeah.
problem.
You're not benefiting from the technology to the
Yep.
extent that you could potentially
Yep.
here. We've talked a number of things here. The Supply Chain Resiliency Council, blockchain, AI, some other stuff. but I think one thing that they all seem to have in common is that it's part of a bigger push for more visibility, more traceability within the supply chain, more resilient supply chains. Um, my final question, because we're running out of time, but can you kind of talk a little bit about the role that standards play in the global supply chain overall, and why standards are so important and why we have to have them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, this is my plea, right? And I mentioned it before. I think it's the foundation upon which you build your competitive differentiation. So if you said, can I just get access to the maximum amount of data about this product, about this transaction, even about this event? Because when you think of a purchase order, right? It's kind of this bulk decision to buy a bunch of stuff, but that stuff doesn't all go to one place. It
Right.
gets spread out all over the world. And I want to start tracking where that stuff is going as I break it down and distribute it, or as materials go into finished goods and they get transformed. And then I think more than ever, Brian, this demand by the consumer to be connected to as much information upstream as possible. What farm did this cotton come from? Where was this fish caught? Those kinds of, esoteric questions that a consumer might ask, and not every consumer, but the ones who care, that they want to know what they want to know. And I think, GS1 has another interesting project underway. We call it Sunrise 2027, or the migration to 2D. And it's really about putting two-dimensional barcodes on products where currently they carry the bars and spaces. Many of you who do self-checkout, you scan at the right at the register, and that thing goes beep and it rings up the right price, and it's just fabulous. But that thing is not connected to the internet, and QR codes, and what happened with open up your own menu on your cell phone, as we all went to restaurants later in the pandemic. um, has opened the conversation for standards to start talking about the importance of a web connected technology that will allow us not only to connect with consumer, provide recipes, promotions, more detailed product information, but also to power supply chain and drive that automation. Because now what you're seeing with so many operations moving to that model where home delivery, curbside pickup, the last mile, partnering with companies like Shipt or DoorDash or Uber Eats or whoever might be delivering the thing to a consumer. Everybody's got to speak the same language, because you want to make sure the consumer gets the product, and you want to make sure that whoever's supposed to get paid gets paid uh, for that having happened. And I think that that is really where I think standards can play a role in: what do I have? Where is it at? Has the right information gotten to the right people to ensure consumer delight and profitability, which I think are, and probably I should throw regulatory compliance in there just as a nod to the government's involvement, um, because those things are all important to a business that wants to succeed.
Yeah, and look, this plays into the broader trend in supply chain these days, right? Which is diversification, right, and moving away from China as your sole source of products. And you're a lot of companies now are, they might be producing products in two, three, four different countries by two or three, four different companies,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
you need to make sure that that same product is being produced by three different companies. You got to have good insight and visibility into what each one is producing, what they're capable of producing, where it's going. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of product in one place and not any and nowhere else.
Yes.
When all
Exactly.
said and done, and we'll be back. Thank you, Melanie. It's all the time we have today. Before we leave, would you like to share how people might be able to get in touch with you or GS1 US if they want to learn more on this topic?
Yes, I mean, certainly gs1us.org. We also have posted a position paper on our website about generative AI and its ability to support some key supply chain use cases.
Mhm.
And I'm always available at mhilton@gs1us.org. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to chat with you. And we're always willing to get the message out there about how standards, the unsung hero of the supply chain, can help.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming on with us and talking about it a little bit. Standards are something people don't pay much attention to, I don't think, until they need them
Yes.
in many ways. So it's good to get the word out there about that and the important role they do play. I want to thank my guest today, Melanie Hilton of GS1 US, for talking on these topics, and reach out to her, obviously, or GS1 US, if you guys want to learn more on the standards and how the role they can play in your businesses. So, thank you also to all of you that took time out of the day to listen to both of us today. We appreciate it. And until next time, I'm Brian Straight, and this has been Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.